When we talk about insufficient transport layer security, we're really talking about a lack of encryption on the network layer. So particularly when we talk about communicating over the web, we're talking about missing HTTPS, or rather applications talking over the insecure HTTP scheme. It's not just that, there are also questions of is it good HTTPS or possibly weak HTTPS? We'll touch on all that as we go through this next section. So let's jump in and have a look at how this risk can manifest itself. Let's take a look at how risks on the transport layer come about. Imagine we have a victim, and the victim is talking backwards and forwards with the web server. Now keep in mind that when this traffic goes over the web, there are a lot of different points in the network. So we often have someone, say, on a wireless device, talking over the air to a wireless router somewhere, possibly going over an internal network somewhere before it hits an ADSL modem, goes out over the telco's lines, eventually hits an ISP, and then goes through the internet backbone and finally makes its way to the web server. There are a lot of different independent components that any traffic goes across. Now, when we talk about attacks on the transport layer, we're talking about a man in the middle, or in other words, an attacker who can jump on the wire somewhere and get between the victim and that target web server. Now, there are multiple places where this could happen. So one example is a rogue Wi-Fi network. The victim goes along to a cafe somewhere, connects to the network, and doesn't realize that the owner of the wireless access point is actually watching all their traffic. Conversely, it may be that the owner of the network is actually a victim themselves and their router has been compromised by an attacker. There are many examples of routers suffering from attacks which change the DNS settings of them. And when that happens and someone makes a request through that router, very often the requests are not resolved to the system they think they're talking to, and instead the requests get routed to an attacker's system. If we go further up the network stack, we can even get to the point of ISP monitoring. There are some really prominent examples of the actual internet service provider watching and in some cases even modifying the traffic when it's going across an insecure transport layer. And that's another point worth making here as well. The risk here is not just about an attacker reading the traffic. When there's a lack of encryption, the attacker can also modify it. And that's the example I'd like to give you right now. So let's jump over to the sample web app, and I'll give you an example of a real-world attack that did actually modify an application in order for an attacker to siphon off credentials. Our sample snowboard app here has a login facility. And what you might notice when we look at this login page is that the address has no HTTPS. So this page has not been loaded securely. But there's an interesting twist to this. If we go and right-click on one of these fields, and we go down and inspect element, we can have a look at how the form is structured. And one of the things we'll find up here is if we scroll up to the form action, we can see that it's actually going to post to HTTPS. So when you submit this form, the username and password will be encrypted and sent securely. Now, many people believe this is sufficient, and they have that belief simply because the credentials are encrypted once you submit the form. Now, what they neglect is that because this login page was not loaded securely, you can't trust the integrity of it. It could have been modified by an attacker. And in fact, if we scroll down a little bit on this page, I have mounted a man-in-the-middle attack, and what I've actually done is dropped in a keylogger. Now, the way a keylogger like this works is it's just JavaScript, and every single time I type a character in any of the fields on the page, that character is going to be sent off to hacker.com. Now, this might look like a very hypothetical risk, but precisely this attack has been mounted in the past against the likes of Facebook. Facebook no longer load any login pages in an insecure way, but there was a time only a few years ago where this is the way it worked, and there are documented examples at the ISP level where keyloggers were injected into Facebook's login page. So let me show you how this one works. What I want to do is jump over to my Network tab, because this is going to show us every single request the browser makes. Now I'm going to scroll down a little bit so we can see our login form, and then watch this as we start typing. I'm going to type in an email address, and see as we did that, a whole bunch of requests just appeared. If I scroll down a little bit, we can see every character that was just typed in, john@gmail.com, and then I'm going to go back to the password field, and I'm going to give John a password. Now, even though we're seeing an obfuscated password field, every single time that key was pressed, that particular key was sent off to hacker.com. We haven't even logged in yet. We've not even pressed the button, but every single step along the way, John was already compromised. Now, keep in mind that any of those points along the network communication that we looked at just before could inject this password keylogger. It's just JavaScript. It's a couple of lines in the HTML source of the web page. So the lesson here is that whilst HTTPS is important, it's about a lot more than just using it piecemeal across the application. You've got to think about not just every place where information needs to remain confidential, but also where integrity is important. What would be the impact if anything that was loaded insecurely was actually changed? Now that we've seen this pretty brief yet very real-world demo, let's move on and have a look at how we can defend against attacks on the transport layer. When we talk about defending against the sorts of risks that we just saw, clearly the number one objective is to apply transport layer security. We want to see TLS applied everywhere possible. And keep in mind that strictly speaking, TLS is the successor to SSL. You will still see the term SSL used quite extensively because it has become such a strong part of the vernacular now. Where we're at today, though, is that we're really getting to the point where TLS should just be on by default. We're moving towards HTTPS everywhere, a secure web as the norm. And in fact, there's increasing pressure for people to move in that direction. Even Google talking about the presence of a secure address as a ranking signal for search engine optimization. They'll actually make you more discoverable if you're using HTTPS. Now, it's not just about using TLS. You need to use good TLS. And in recent times, we've seen many attacks against weak TLS. So for example, we saw things like the Poodle attack in 2014. It's not just that, we saw numerous other exploits against old implementations of cryptography on the transport layer. So by all means, encrypt everything, apply TLS very liberally, but apply the right TLS. It's also more than just the network layer. It's very much about getting the applications to actually use transport layer security properly. So what we just saw was a great example. When that login page was loaded insecurely, that was the app design that did that. When developers are building these apps, they need to be conscious of the risks posed by insecure communications. So the login form was one example. Another common one that's gotten wrong is things like authentication cookies. Are they ever passed around without encryption? That's enough for an attacker to steal someone's session, which can have dire consequences. So getting developers educated and getting them on board with the value proposition of transport layer security is also really critical. And finally, the risk posed by a man in the middle is not just constrained to the external environment. Very often, communications between systems within internal networks are left wide open, no security at all. And it happens because there is this assumption, a false assumption, that traffic behind the firewall is already secure. The bad guys are on the outside, the good guys are on the inside. And you often hear people talking about this paradox of corporate security, which is the hard shell and the soft center. Attacks do happen behind the firewall. Transport layer security internally is also absolutely essential, and you want to apply that just as liberally as what you do in the external environment as well. So that's attacks on the transport layer. Do remember integrity as well as confidentiality, and apply TLS very liberally, both externally and internally. Now that we've covered that, let's move on and start talking about the way passwords are stored.